So hey everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Ask an Expert. Today, we have a real special guest who's going to talk about a really important topic. So please welcome Elizabeth Berry, who's going to talk about her PhD life and probably give us some insight on her research work as well.
Hey guys, my name is Elizabeth, and I am a PhD candidate studying the neuroscience of addiction in my dissertation.
What it's like to do a PhD?
You might be wondering what it's like to do a PhD, maybe. So you're interested in science, maybe you've done a little bit of research in the lab, and you're like, should I do a PhD? So I can give you some insight on that. So doing a PhD is purposely so that you can be responsible for the research that you do in the future. So let's, for example, you get a master's degree and you want to still work in a research lab. If you have a master's degree, you can work in a research lab, of course, and the only thing is you're not going to be able to decide what questions to ask, what research to pursue, and you can't really apply for grants for receiving money to do the research experiments. Whereas if you can do your PhD, you have the ability, once you have your degree, to apply for grants, become in leadership positions so that you can actually decide the research being done and direct the research and ask whatever questions that you want. So a PhD allows you the leadership role, where a master's degree doesn't necessarily allow you to obtain the leadership role as easily.
How is the day-to-day life of a neuroscience PhD?
Doing a PhD in research is different from if you were doing a PhD in history or psychology or something else like math or teaching or something like that. For a PhD in neuroscience, you are in the lab basically every single day. I'm conducting experiments. I do a mix of wet lab work and computer work, so you have to do the experiments and then you have to take your results from your experiments and analyze them, write them up, and then publish papers. So my day-to-day life is pretty variable. I make my own schedule for the most part, but it is a mix of laboratory work and computer work.
Why study addiction?
So why study addiction? Addiction is a huge problem in our society actually today. So there are many different types of drugs of abuse that are found illegally throughout the world. The biggest epidemic right now is actually on opioids, on fentanyl specifically. A lot of illegal use of fentanyl is occurring, and this unfortunately leads to overdoses and a lot of deaths in the population. And it's unfortunate because people are consuming this drug and becoming addicted to it and are unable to stop use once becoming addicted to it because their body just craves the drug over and over again. And then a lot of the time will end up in the individual's demise.
What is addiction?
What does it mean to be addicted? So there are many different types of addiction, I guess you could say. Someone could be like, oh, I'm addicted to playing video games, or like I'm addicted to, working out or something like that for their adrenaline rush. But the base cause and definition of addiction is due to the consumption of drugs of abuse. And so to be addicted, that means that you have the inability to stop using a substance of abuse. You have periods where you crave the drug, you consume the drug, and then you have periods where you are not on the drug, you're withdrawing from the drug. And so there are periods of highs and lows. You feel euphoria when you're taking the drug of abuse, but then there's periods of lows where there's a lot of negative mental states, depressive states. You don't feel good at all. Your body is unhappy, it's on a low state of the drug. And this person that is consuming the drugs of abuse will, periodically just go through this cycle over and over and over again. And you would think that, this person can just stop using the drug whenever they want. But they actually can't. They're kind of stuck in this cycle and are unable to pull themselves out because their brain is changed by consuming this drug of abuse over and over again. and they are unable to pull themselves out of that cycle.
How do drugs like opioid and cocaine affect the brain?
Let me talk to you a little bit about what goes on in the brain when someone consumes drugs of abuse. So no matter if it's like cocaine or an opioid or amphetamines, all of those, they cause the same reaction in the brain. And that is the flood of a neurotransmitter that's called dopamine. So normally in the brain, for example, when you eat something that you enjoy, you do an activity that you like, you win a competition, something that brings you reward, you get a flood of dopamine in the brain, this neurotransmitter dopamine. But in the situation where you're consuming drugs of abuse, the tables are a little turned. So all of these drugs of abuse will cause an overwhelmingly large amount of dopamine to be released in the brain. Not the normal amount that you get when you eat something you like, but way too much dopamine released in the brain. And your brain doesn't know what to do with this. And so after multiple periods of consuming the drugs of abuse and this large influx of dopamine every single time that someone consumes them, your brain gets changed over time. And the changes that happen in the brain, us scientists are trying to figure out exactly what they are and can they be prevented or reversed if someone wants to withdraw and stop using drugs of abuse later on down the road.
Where in the brain is dopamine made?
The region of the brain that actually releases all of the dopamine in a state of addiction when consuming a drug of abuse is called the ventral tegmental area, or VTA for short if you look it up. And in this nucleus in the brain, it contains dopaminergic neurons that produce the neurotransmitter dopamine. And so when you consume a drug of abuse, these neurons become activated and release dopamine out to all the regions that they're connected to in the brain. And there's one region that's really important that scientists have figured out to the addiction paradigm that we're all working on. And so these dopaminergic neurons that release dopamine in the ventral tegmental area release the dopamine down to another region called the nucleus accumbens, or NAC, if you see that abbreviated. And the neurons in the nucleus accumbens react to that dopamine and are changed by that dopamine flux.
What is your area of research in the brain?
There are many other regions that these dopaminergic neurons in the ventral tegmental area are connected with, and we are still discovering all the different regions that are actually impacted and irreversibly changed by continued drug of abuse consumption. The region of the brain that I work on is called the hypothalamus, specifically the lateral hypothalamus, and I work on orexin neurons or hypocretin neurons. They have two names because two different scientists discovered them at the same time. So I'm going to stick with the name orexin because that's the term that my lab uses. So orexin neurons are also connected to the dopaminergic neurons in the ventral tegmental area. And I'm studying how these specific neurons are changed by opioid addiction in my dissertation project.
How does neuroscience differ from psychology?
You need both the psychological standpoint and the neuroscience standpoint in order to think about a disease and figure out what's going on. You need a psychological standpoint to figure out initially what's going on with the disease, to actually identify the problem, because without that, you wouldn't have the thought to actually go and investigate why the brain isn't working anymore, or maybe there's an abnormality that needs to be figured out.
How may a neuroscientist and a psychologist look at the same disease?
For example, let's say we have a neuroscientist and a psychologist. Let's talk about the differences in how they would observe the same disease, for example. So we have Alzheimer's disease. It is a neurodegenerative disease. It is pretty commonly known about nowadays. And what happens to the patient is that over time they lose the ability to retain new memories and even remember things that they've known like their entire life. For example, like an adult, like a patient that is a parent, they may no longer like physically recognize their own child when they walk in the door. So it's like a really sad disease. And so first let's talk about how a psychologists would look at this if you were looking at psychology. So they would look at the behavior of the individual. They would look at patterns that develop. They would look at ways for detecting if an individual was losing their memory for early detection, so they can catch the disease early and identify it and try to alleviate some of the symptoms early on. Where a neuroscientist would look at this and be like, what is causing this person to lose their memory? What is causing this person to be unable to actually, remember things that they've known their entire life? They would want to know what's going on in the neurons. Where in the brain are there problems going on? What region is malfunctioning? How can we fix this? And so a neuroscientist would say, okay, let's find the region that's not working. Let's figure out why the neurons aren't working. Let's figure out why they're degenerating. And let's figure out the proteins that are involved. Let's figure out if there are genetic changes in the neurons, in the DNA. And let's figure out if we can find some treatments to stop this from happening, to give these patients a better way to remember longer and to, fix this problem in itself.
Alright, so that's for how long we had Elizabeth for this. I would like to thank Elizabeth for taking time out of her busy schedule and for sharing all these intricate details with such beautiful depth. With that being said, I would like to present Elizabeth with this virtual bouquet and wish her all the best for her research work. Thank you so much.